Utah. I am coming just right on time at 2. So I appreciate everyone's attendance. It looks like we have Dr. Brooks and Dr. LaGrange, both of our presenters. And I want to just welcome everybody to the session. My name is Terry Law. I'm the Vice President for Student and Donor Engagement. As I think all of you know, our HU Talks are part of our Homecoming 2022 activities. We hope to see you at also some of our in-person events. We've got the Cowboy Lounge Friday night, 5K, a football game, alumni tailgate before the football game, just about everything you could want. And so when we begin, I will mute folks except for our speakers, and then we'll unmute as it's time for Q&A. Please try to stay muted in case you accidentally unmute yourself, or I do, to reduce our background noise. We are recording, as most of you saw, and we want to thank our student sign language interpreters and their coordinator, Carol Litherland, for helping us provide this service for all of our HU talks. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Brooks and Dr. Linda LaGrange, our presenters for today, and I'll let you guys take it away.
Alrighty, hello everyone. I'll go ahead and get the screen share going. Let's see. All right, does that look good? Yes, awesome. Well, my name is Thomas Brooks. I'm a faculty member in the psychology department here at NMHU. I'm joined by Dr. Linda LaGrange, who's also in the psychology department. And today we're going to reflect on trauma and grief and the Calf Canyon and Hermit's Peak fires of this year. Just to kind of orient us through this talk, we'll speak briefly about trauma and grief and look at what these frameworks, how to use these frameworks and understand what Northern New Mexico went through in the last year. I have some quick facts on the Calf Canyon and Hermit's Peak fires for you. I also was able to collect some data from my Introduction to Psychology course this semester in time for the talk that I want to walk y'all through. And then I want to invite Dr. LaGrange to join me and reflect on her experiences with the fires, evacuations, and then looking towards the future. And then we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. So what is trauma? So typically trauma is conceptualized often by the event itself. So people often talk about a traumatic event that happened to them. And the event is very important, and we'll kind of get to that when we dive into some DSM diagnostic criteria. But oftentimes, it's most helpful to think about trauma as a disruption in the functioning of the nervous system. And so as humans, as animals more broadly, we have a threat response cycle. And so this response cycle keeps us both alive as well as regulated within our environments. And so we can healthily move through them, notice when things are off, and then get through disastrous events. And so our first step over here in the threat response cycle is the event itself. So the, oh no, I'm going to die event. Your midbrain engages in a defensive response. And so we usually respond with a startle. So we jump, we orient towards the threat, and then we respond to it. And so this is our flight, fight, or freeze response. And then do we survive the event? So if we survive, then we discharge. And this discharge usually involves crying, shaking, getting a bit of a temperature, etc., to work off those chemicals that were put together for us to jump forward and survive our situation. And this is really important for actual threats. Now, when trauma happens, this system gets dysregulated, and so people start to respond to danger when they're no longer under threat. And so one of the ways that this conceptualizes is with our dysregulated nervous system window of tolerance model. And so you see this light gray line right here. And so this is normal human functioning. So as things get stressful, we kind of ramp up a little bit. We start to get on edge, and then we can move back down and calm ourselves down. Perhaps a more stressful event in life happens, and so we peak again, and then maybe we go down into, feeling exhausted or tired or need to shut down or isolate because too much sensory information has been coming at us. So throughout the normal day, we can ride this wave up and down within our window of tolerance. And so our bodies are typically very good at managing day-to-day life stress. Now, after a traumatic event, and when we start to say that someone has trauma or is experiencing traumatic symptoms, we start to look at this black line where we start to bounce above and beyond just normal elevation into hyperarousal, which is going to be our fight, flight, or freeze response. And so normal little bitty things throughout the day will start to have larger impacts on someone's psychology and physiology. Similarly, we can go into hypoarousal, which is the collapse and shutdown. And so this can be rather catatonic, and this can move either within the day, within the week, depending on what triggers are present within that individual's environment. And so when we talk about trauma, it's not so much just the event itself, but how we respond to stimuli after that event. Are we still regulated? Are we able to process day-to-day stressors? Or are those stressors too much for us and we start to move into areas of hyper survival? And so when we talk about trauma, that is really what we're talking about, is this: what happens after the event? Now, the event, like I said, is important. So if we look at the DSM-5, our current diagnostic statistical manual for diagnosing psychological disorders, for post-traumatic stress disorder, exposure to actual or threatened death is one of the criteria for getting this diagnosis. And so when we think of PTSD, we think of people who have experienced awful situations, whether that be veterans overseas in war zones, or whether it be women in abusive relationships, or people who have experienced natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, or more recently, our fires this year in 2022. A couple other symptoms for diagnostic purposes: you have to have intrusive symptoms. So these can be thoughts, dreams, memories, flashbacks, sometimes even voices. Persistent avoidance, and so this is where you aren't moving towards the root of the issue, you're moving around it and kind of recreating your life to avoid these triggers. There's negative cognitive or emotional affects going on, so a lot of negative self-talk, a lot of depressive, angry, irritable moods, and then reactivity. And so we can think of reactivity as the trigger hits, and then we're in fight, flight, or freeze mode. Because my background is in educational psychology, most of my research has been with students who have experienced trauma in the past and are trying to navigate public school systems. And so a lot of the symptoms, while they may not have an official PTSD diagnosis, will look like low frustration tolerance, inhibited critical thinking skills, issues with task completion, avoidance, and initiating challenging tasks. And so if you ask them to write a term paper, for example, they will avoid starting that task and following through with it. Attentional problems, emotional dysregulation, and sensory motor disturbances. And so a lot of fidgeting, a lot of tactile issues as well. Now, one of the things, and this will kind of come together when we speak more directly about the Calf Canyon and Hermit's Peak fires, is that there is a little bit of a gray space between trauma and grief symptoms. And so grief, we have now in our current DSM, I believe, the edition that just came out this year, which is a revision of DSM-5, we have prolonged grief disorder. And so this is an intense yearning for the deceased, preoccupations with thoughts or memories of the deceased. And this is a distinct psychological phenomena outside of PTSD. And so we have Linfrick et al. 2021, which looked at people who experienced the death of a loved one tragically or violently and tracked both PTSD symptoms and prolonged grief disorder symptoms, and found that while the two are highly related and there are some gray spaces in between, that these are distinct constructs. And so with an event like the fires, for example, there could be a little bit of both happening within the population, both trauma from the actual evacuation, as well as grief over loss of, well, there weren't any fatalities with the fires, but grief over loss of, say, the family home or cultural importance, things like that. There's a couple modalities of grief. So one of them is instrumental. So this is a very problem-solving, controlling, future-focused way to deal with grief. And so it's a lot of building up for the future, a lot of forward thinking, a lot of maintenance of relationships, stuff like that. And then there's the intuitive side, which is high emotions, lots of shared feelings, some existential angst as well around the concept of death. And one of the things to keep in mind with grief is that expression doesn't necessarily matter. So this is very culturally contingent. So depending on which cultural background you have will determine what's appropriate modes of grief or how to express grief. But just in general, none of these modes are considered pathological. So it can be, you can be isolating, you can be connecting with others, you can be angry, you can be sad, you can be apathetic, you could be expressive, you could laugh, you could cry. Grief takes many different faces, and depending on the cultural context, the most appropriate one is going to come down to that instance. I do want to take a minute since we're talking about grief. I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with the Kubler-Ross model. This is probably the most famous model of grief. So you go through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And there's this idea that we move through these stages very nice and clean, and we go from one to the other. And then lately, I've been seeing a lot of stuff where people bounce between stages or skip stages, and that kind of defeats the purpose of a stage model of grief in of itself. So I don't typically conceptualize grief with Kubler-Ross, despite her fantastic work. I prefer the dual process model, where you have two different modes of processing happening at the same time. So there's a confrontational. So this is emotional, confronting the loss, actively grieving in all of the ways that are appropriate for you. And then there's the restoration process, where it focuses on moving forward and the future and building. And so there's a constructive element and an empathetic element that are working simultaneously. And depending on where you're at in the process, one could be stronger than the other. You could switch between the two, but they are both equally important to this process of grief. And so with our two models, both of trauma as a process and grief as a process, let's take a look at our Calf Canyon and Hermit's Peak fires. And so these are the largest fires in New Mexico history, and so far the largest in the US for 2022. They started out as distinct fires, so they were isolated. So Hermit's Peak started in April 6th. Calf Canyon started on April 19th. They merged on April 22nd, and then they were finally 100% contained. The most recent report I saw was from August 21st. They were 100% contained. There was a loss of over 300,000 acres. There were thankfully 0 fatalities, but in terms of homes and structures that were destroyed, it was estimated, we don't have official numbers yet, between 1 and 1,500 structures have been destroyed. So these are both residential as well as farm, as well as commercial buildings as well. These are also culturally important locations for the people in northern New Mexico. When I asked my intro to psychology students this semester what their experiences were back during the height of the fires and the evacuations, I gave them a quick survey just to kind of see where they were at and what they had experienced. And so 12.5% evacuated or took care of family members. Only about 6.25% had lost a family member, lose a home, or had to use emergency services, or experienced health complications due to smoke inhalation. And then over a third of them helped evacuate friends and family. So for my students, at least, they were mostly involved in the helping of people who were going through evacuating and losing their properties with the fires. In terms of the effects of the fires, by far the most prevalent effect was emotional. So it's up there around just below 4 on a 1 to 7 score. And then continued anxiety and social issues are right below that. Continued anxiety is kind of a proxy for me for kind of looking at like trauma as a process. And so for people who are still on edge about what happened during the fires, this is kind of my proxy measure for that. I didn't give them a full trauma criteria to fill out in the survey. That might have been a bit heavy for an intro class, but I just wanted to check to see like, hey, are you still managing? And some of them are still experiencing some anxiety. And then financial, below the midpoint. So some students did suffer financially from the fires, which if we look at this table of students who scored between 4 and 7 on our 1 to 7 scale, about 30% of them experienced emotional, social, and continued anxiety distress, while 20% experienced financial distress from the fires. And so obviously, like, caveats are important here. Only about 10 of my students had direct experience with the fires. And so this is capturing a very small picture of overall what the community went through, but I did want to share that data. I also asked them to include some of their experiences just written qualitatively. And so one student does report that they have severe anxiety and depression, as well as PTSDs, and that the fire affected them immensely. Another one talked about how their family didn't evacuate, and how they tried to save the house by pre-watering the ground and trees. And then another student, which I found most related to my experience going through the fires, was just constantly keeping track of updates through that time. I was personally, I was refreshing that map at least 10 times a day, which probably wasn't healthy, but also this was a life or death circumstance, so it may have been appropriate for that. And so that is what my students went through. I want to invite Dr. LaGrange to join me, and she had a more visceral experience with the fires than I did. I was out in Romeroville, and so I just switched between, red and yellow for like a month straight in the evacuation orders. And so, Dr. LaGrange, thank you.
Hi there. Let's see, are we going to share the photos of the aftermath, or how are we going to do that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Do you want to walk me through your experience with the fires, and then we'll go through the photos and talk about the future?
Sure. And I think we were probably like most of Ukraine was just before the invasion. We just didn't believe it was going to happen, really, and kept finding reasons to cling to that belief. So the day that we evacuated was the day that you and I, Thomas, were talking in the student ballroom on Earth Day, which is sort of ironic, because I had to leave to go evacuate. And we evacuated, but really didn't think it was going to make it to our place. So we snuck back, and I don't know how. We saw so many people doing exactly what we did. They blocked all the main roads, but they didn't get the all 4 service roads. And so all of us were creeping back to check on our property. So we did this 3 times. And the last time we were there, there were fire department units from Montana, Missoula, Montana, that are going all around the house, setting up sprinklers and cleaning out the rain gutters. And I mean, they were so nice and so helpful, and we really felt comfortable. And we left that time. They said, "We're leaving, you should leave now too." The bad thing about that departure was the animals were so upset. The inside cats, from all the people walking around on the roof, we couldn't get them out. And so when the fire did actually get there, it killed our dogs and our cats and our chickens. And yeah, that was far worse than any tangible thing that we lost. But we kept monitoring it. Like you said, you watched those updates, and I just looked at it one morning and I said, well, whatever was going to happen has happened, because you could see that perimeter had moved across our land, so we didn't know. And we found out, we were here in Albuquerque at a Target, and one of my old friends from Highlands saw me, and we were talking. And I said, we're waiting to see if our house is still there. And then just when that happened, my husband just looked up from the phone and said, just shook his head no. And so I think that because I was with someone at the time, I found out I didn't break down. I didn't do anything. And it's interesting that one of the 2 dogs she gave me that got killed. And so she said, was Jake there? And I said, Jake was there. And so then we parted. And I think you talked about forward thinking. That's what I did. Immediately started planning. This is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to do. I mean, I never dwelled on it to any, maybe 5 minutes at a time. But we've gone through all of these plans for what are we going to do, and how are we going to make something out of this. And I absolutely believe that surrounding yourself with friends is a really important thing. I see Nariman there. I see he's around, and so we've been out with Nariman, and we've had people come down to Albuquerque and take us out to lunch or dinner or breakfast, and then we've joined in all of these post-fire efforts to educate ourselves on what we can do now. And so throwing ourselves into all of these volunteer efforts, and then being far more sociable than we've ever been in our life, really does help. Oh, there's Nariman. I see him, and Nariman's teaching me how to make Persian food. And so, life is full of things that set you back, but boy, if you've got good people around you and you've got a good attitude, you can face just about anything.
I'm going to go ahead and scroll through these photos if you want to talk
Sure.
about them and tell us what we're looking at.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Let's see. There we go.
And one of the reasons that Thomas was talking about grief was that because our evacuations continued for so long, there was no sudden trauma and then when we finally saw what you're going to see in these pictures, it had already happened. And so there was some of this visceral feeling that he was discussing, but it was drawn out for over a period of a week and a half, from the first evacuation to the point at which we knew for sure that the house had not made it. And so when the trauma is that long, I think you have enough time to prepare yourself, maybe. I don't know. Because when we finally saw it, I was unprepared. I thought I was prepared, but I was unprepared. And I was just absolutely adamant that we would return and rebuild and, make this right. But we've been back 4 times, and each time I've come to the conclusion finally after the 4th that we can't go back there, at least the way it is now. So we bought other property, and we're going to rebuild close, and we're going to remediate all of the damage that we can to the property. But I don't know that I can ever go back to live.
Mm-hmm.
So did you find those photos, or
They should be up.
are they?
I think so.
Let's see.
We can see them.
Oh, okay, good.
Oh, okay.
You may scroll
I
back through them, Linda, and you can talk about them.
For some, I can't see. I don't know why. Let's try. Oh, there we go.
I'm not sure where that noise is coming from. If somebody's not on mute and not speaking, could you?
Were you able to see him, Linda?
I was a little bit just there. I can see a real small version in my small screen. There we go. Okay.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
scroll
fine.
through them and you can talk about them and tell me when
Okay.
the next one.
I'm sorry. That is the garage. We lost SETI message that we lost one vehicle. And then right behind there, you can see our neighbor's house was gone. So our house and the next 3 houses were completely destroyed. And then the house towards Leduc's to our left was spared. And so it was very difficult. So that's the garage and the car. And the next one, I think, or the next slide is of that down there, our house was right there. And I was telling somebody, they said the walls are still there. And it took me 10 years to build all those walls. I went out and found the rocks and piled them and collected them and made the wall. And so the wall is sort of a testament to the fact that we were there. But as you can see, there is nothing, absolutely nothing but the foundation and the twisted metal of the roof. Okay, and then I think the next one is, well, that's on the other side of the house, looking back up the hill. And you can see that it was, there are no surviving trees there. It was one of the highest severity spots there was. I mean, the ground is totally devoid of any kind of needles, debris, anything. It's just bare, bare, bare. And then that's also the house looking down towards the stream. There are a few surviving trees down there by the stream. And then the floods have been really damaging. They've taken out, there's an acequia up here, and that's destroyed. That'll have to be completely rebuilt. And then, of course, the stream rose about 15 feet and took out all the fence work all up and down the valley. Nobody has intact fences anymore. This is, by the way, Morphy Canyon, where we lived. And then I think the last one is of, oh yeah, that's the basement, or what used to be the basement. And some of these oak trees we've been talking about, workshopping about what to expect after the fire goes through. And just as an aside, it's not part of the grief and trauma that we're supposed to be talking about, but what I found out is if you live on property where there were ponderosa pines, if there's even just a little bit of tuft of green needles at the top, don't take it down. There's a chance it will survive. And so we're going to go back on Friday with some of the forestry people and go through and look at all the things that we think will survive, and then start taking out the rest with a masticator or something like that. That's the steps headed down to the stream. It was a beautiful, beautiful place to live in. I've been there for 30 years, and we just had the stream burbling along all the time. Even in dry years, it kept flowing. You can see some of those trees in the background have the little tufts. This is the neighbor in the background there whose house survived. However, he is not going back. The heat was so intense that there was a lot of interior damage, and his insurance was inadequate. And so he probably won't be going back. This is my potting shed, and these were my raised beds. Interestingly, the raised beds are now like petrified mounds of dried, burnt dirt. So, and then that's the truck. I couldn't believe that the insurance company came and got that truck. I don't know why, but they did. It's not there anymore. So we'll see. I know that one of the things that, if have friends who have a similar situation, the rains, as destructive as they were, have caused the whole area to really green up. There's grass, there's returning oak. it is really looking nice after all of that rain. So if you have any questions, Thomas, that I can answer, or Gloria has raised her hand.
Linda, thanks for sharing that with us. I can't even put myself in that situation. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened like with the wildlife in that area? I know you were very closely connected to the wildlife there. And then have you guys been having any problems with flooding up there because of of all the flash flood warnings?
Mm-hmm. Well, we've been talking about the animals, and like for instance, we had tasselured squirrels, bear squirrels that they were practically pets, and I was talking to someone the other day, and they think that they probably were aware enough to get away. And the birds, they were just nesting. So we're going to have a real problem with, having to build back the bird population. And it was wonderful where we were because we had water and we had all kinds of resources for them. And the parents, I'm sure, survived, but no, there will be no offspring from this. And there's no habitat left for them. And then the flooding, we are in a fairly deep canyon, and our place is 50 feet above. And so there was flooding, but we weren't in the floodplain, which didn't matter, but since everything's gone anyway. And so probably what it did for that property is it probably increased its fertility by bringing in all of these nutrients and things. So, and then we'll have to rebuild the fence. So, but thanks for asking.
Eric Romero.
Thank you for both analysis and Linda sharing your story. I'm sure it's hard to share even on a video format. Condolences. I wanted to ask again, there's a little bit of difference here because this is human caused. This was not a natural disaster.
Yeah.
So within that cycle of trauma and not only emotional, but kind of cognitive response, there's a culpability that goes along with this. There's an identifiable protagonist. And one, how does that, my first question is, how does that relate to the grieving process or a rebuilding process? And two, I want to remind you that many of these communities that lost land, it's not so much cyclical, but there's also a historical trauma of land loss that is also attributed to the Forest Service. Many of the land grant communities in New Mexico have that historical trauma of land loss where they hold the Forest Service accountable. And again, here the Santa Fe, that was significantly made up from the Mora land grant, the Las Vegas land grant, the Miguel del Vado land grants. And so there's that sense of land loss that's been anchored in the social memory of many of our community members. And now on top of it, the Forest Service comes in again and with an error kind of destroys. And part of the tangibles that you're speaking about, Linda, again, you shared the loss of animals, but also those heritage values of traditional land use patterns. It isn't a count of how many trees did you lose, how much of your livelihood, and you, again, you go up there, you're familiar with where the Oshai is, you know where your medicinals are at. That was also lost, and maybe they're not coming back. So it isn't just a material loss and the tangibles you speak, it's a loss of a lifestyle. And how does that have an impact?
Okay, well, let's talk about the culpability, and I can immediately share a contrast where my husband and I know who was responsible for it, but at the same time, our response to that has been different. And mine has been to acknowledge that there was a lack of responsibility taking by these people who didn't put out the slash pile that was started in January and then flared up in April. And I've acknowledged that, but I have actually moved on. I'm not angry anymore. I was. My husband, on the other hand, is angry. He's very, very upset. And so I don't know exactly how to share that. And then the other part that you were talking about, knowing where all the OSHA was, knowing where all of the things, the plants and medicinal herbs that I used to work with. My sense is that nature will bounce back. I mean, I really believe the OSHA will reappear where it was. There may be some complete loss, but nature is an extremely resilient force. And I just witnessing that and in light of all of the greenery right now. And then the heritage that you speak of, where I can recall when I first started teaching here, I had a student who was from San Ignacio. And this was 30 years ago, and they could not believe how the Forest Service would not even allow them to go get wood in their communal areas. And so this issue of a federal agency imposing certain things or taking away certain things is longstanding, and this probably won't be the last time that we encounter something like this, because there's a certain arrogance in huge agencies. It doesn't matter what agency, there's arrogance that, they can do no wrong. It's not individuals, it's just a sort of a pervasive, I don't know how to describe it, pervasive, not philosophy, but there's just this assumption if they're doing it right. And they just weren't this time. But for my personal well-being, I just let go and don't cling to the resentment that I felt at first. I don't know if that answered your question, Eric, but anyway.
I can also supplement that. Like I mentioned in the talk, my training and research in trauma has mostly been with children, but I have a feeling that the reaction to the culpability of this incident in relation to trauma and grief is probably going to be analogous to families who lose a family member due to like homicide, for example, and that really, really heavy work that you have to go through to be personally okay. But I think the biggest difference here is that there's also a very like active element as well, where this is like individuals against this organization or this agency that has continually abused them. And so there's also this like both historical element, but also this forward facing element there, as opposed to get this individual into jail, for example. But I have a feeling that the psychological work involved is probably very similar.
Thank you.
So Nariman, I saw you tried to say something before and we couldn't hear you. Now we still can't hear you. Nope. You sound like the chipmunks.
Any other questions? Do folks have any other questions or comments? Gloria.
Yeah, if it's okay, I have another. And so Linda, the last time I chatted with you and just checked in with you, you were hoping to go back. I guess I don't know if it's a stupid question or not, but how did you come to the realization that going back just wasn't going to be worth the time, the investment, the energy, and then how close are you going to be able to get there in terms of the property you bought?
Well, I think what told me that it wouldn't be a good idea to go back was the fact that after we returned 4 times, and each time it was not any easier. There was no sense of, I can deal with this. It just got worse. And so every time we'd leave, we'd be very depressed. And I mean, not pathologically, but, you know, we would be down. And so the property we bought was in Pandaray, the part that did not burn, an area that's out in the open grass. So it's probably 5 miles from our house. So we can stay there, we can live there and do things on the property. And there may be, once we've mitigated all of the damage, maybe we would return. I don't know. And but right now it is just you know, when you work with something with your own hands for 30 years and you planted millions of bulbs and trees and transplanted, and now they're all gone. It's just so daunting to think of trying to get it back to where it was, that I think we both thought that it would be just better to start over somewhere else and then work at our leisure on restoring the property. Because oh, I see in the background, is that a kitty cat in the background there, Gloria? Here's what I want to tell you something. When we lost the pets, I just could not imagine recovering without a pet, animals. So my stepdaughter found a litter of 3 kittens. Yeah. That they were little bitty, and she brought them over, and they have been the most helpful, therapeutic thing that you know, it's just they're wonderful. And I just see, we love them when they all get all curled up. It just makes our blood pressure go down. You know, just that it's so helpful in terms of physiological responses to stress, just to have those pets around. So yeah, thanks for asking, and thanks for letting us see your kitty. I locked mine out because they're kittens and they don't know. They'll climb my leg while I'm trying to talk. So any other questions?
Okay, sorry to hog all the time. I am wondering, did you have to deal with FEMA? How did your insurance company handle it? Did you have any problems? Like, tell us a little bit about the bureaucracy.
Okay, so in fact, I was going to talk a little bit about that. Our insurance paid out the policy limits without any hesitation. There was a little bit, they sent me an Excel sheet and said, go from room to room to room and tell me everything that was in it, and including a toothbrush. And I said, you know, I sent him the pictures. I said, there's nothing there. I don't even remember. And that the trauma of trying to remember was that I realized how much I had lost. Even though they were tangible things, there were some that had value in terms of they belong. My mother gave me a Rolex just before she died. That is no longer, you know, just very sentimental things. And to have to remember everything. Finally, I said, I'm going to do a Word document and I'll just list everything I can remember. And then from that point on, they were great. They were great. We got our checks. We got everything worked out. We did not bother with FEMA because of all the horror stories we heard. And then the debris removal, that is so bureaucratized. I mean, there's just bureaucracy after bureaucracy. We did not do that. I said, it'll be years before anybody comes to help us clean. So we had a private contractor come in and removed all of the debris, and then we'll take care of the dead trees later. So I think we were really, really fortunate in how the aftermath turned out for us, because we have sufficient money to buy the lots and rebuild a home. So we're very fortunate. Anybody else?
Other questions? Gloria, if you have more questions.
Just thank you so much for sharing. Yeah.
One more. Okay. I don't know anything about debris removal. So is that state? Is that federal? Who's over that? And what was the holdup about that?
I'm not sure. I think it is state, but they had some very strange requirements. You had to take off the top 6 inches of topsoil before they would go in. I mean, they contracted, what they did, the state contracted out to private bidders. And some of those bidders had not ever done anything like that before. And they came up with these rules and these requirements that were, you know, theoretically, you were supposed to do that removal of the topsoil so that any toxins that had leached out of your dwelling or any place else would not contaminate wherever it was they were taking this debris. And we actually didn't get that far. We just heard about this last Saturday. We were hearing some people talk about that problem. And I think it was near Mineral Hill, where they were out there asking people to do strange things. So the private contractor just, you know, they got a bid. All our neighbors did exactly what we did. They came out, set up porta potties, just took care of it. And it was just so much easier. So when my insurance company actually paid for the debris removal, I didn't even know I had that coverage. So I you know, having insurance is hard up there. I know it's expensive because of things like this. And so we were lucky that we did have insurance with a local agency that it went very smoothly. So I'm grateful for that. Your cat is making me sleepy.
Just thank you for sharing that with us, Linda, and just you know, my heart goes out to you, and like I said, I can't put myself in your shoes, but I hope you know that the Highlands family is here for you always.
Oh, thank you. I really do appreciate it, and that has been our experience. That all colleagues and people that we knew at Highlands really were supportive of us, and it made a huge difference. I can't tell you how much. So whenever if you say something to someone who's witnessed or experienced some kind of disaster, let me know what I can do to help. It's not a light thing. Every time somebody said that to me, I took it to heart. It meant something. So thank you very much.
Well, and thank you, Dr. Brooks and Dr. LaGrange. It was a wonderful presentation. I do just want to mention, because of the topic, we do have the Faculty Staff Fire Relief Fund for those who have been affected by the fires. And if anyone that you know has been affected and is interested in applying, please just email me for the application through the foundation. Up to $1,000 in an award from the fund can be made to help folks who have been directly affected by the fires. So please spread that word if folks are not aware. And thank you all. Thank you for the lovely session. And thank you so much, Dr. Brooks, Dr. LaGrange, for sharing your story.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.